Can you see those okay, you?
Yeah, they're perfect.
Yes, I can. Yeah, good. So I would like to welcome Claire, Vaughan, and Candace Imison for the final talk before we then move on to the workshop. So Claire is the impact lead at the NIHR and is also lead for the NIHR Research Impact Training Program. And Candace is Associate Director of Evidence and Dissemination at the NIHR Center for Engagement and Dissemination. So both have, I think, quite a track record in impact and have a central role to play within the NIHR, and obviously many of those probably attending this event wonder about or think about or have done already applied for NIHR funding. So this is highly relevant in that context. There is, I think, I sometimes wonder about the different philosophies of impact, but this is perhaps less relevant in this meeting. So I hand over to Claire and Candace, and many thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jörg. And so, yes, Claire and I are going to do a double act. We'll oscillate between us as we go through the presentation. So the sort of core of the presentation is sharing a strategic review that we've been doing in NIHR, which has had as its core question, how can we maximize impact? And obviously that is highly interdependent with how can we best support researchers to maximize impact, because it is your impact that is our impact. So we have agendas that are inextricably linked, and I hope you will find the presentation, as Julie was saying, complementary to the two excellent presentations, I have to say, that we've had so far. And I think we will be pulling out some of the challenges that you do face in delivering impact. And I was really struck by Sabina's comment, which I think is at the heart of some of the issues that we face here. We've got a couple of questions at the end, and we'd really welcome your reflections. So my first slide really underlines a point that I think Julie was touching on in her presentation, which is that impact is part, or sort of potentially you could frame it as the end of a journey, which has many elements to it, all of which are happening, we hope, at the same time, and that support impact, be that what is described as the sort of release of findings, which is at the most passive end, those publications, dissemination, which I think not everyone gets, is taking that and really proactively targeting them towards the audience that you want them to reach, and really potentially then sort of packaging those findings up in a different way for that audience. And then knowledge mobilization, which is this stakeholder engagement right the way across the research cycle if you're going to maximize the impact, which is what Julie, I think, was touching on. And really we got out very, very strongly from Mark's presentation at the beginning, which was his stakeholders were integral to the sort of design of the intervention and the research that they did. And then, as Julie was saying, making the point that impact itself is that contribution that we're making to the wider economy and the health and wealth of the nation. So for NIHR, this is a really important agenda. Since 2018, we've had a vision for impact, which is sort of framed in the picture there. In our latest iteration of our strategy, the best research for best health, the next chapter, it was drawn out as a particular issue. But the challenge for us in our review is how do we increase the odds of that impact? The review itself has been a piece of own sort of, as it were, an internal research. So we've been interviewing people, we've done desk research, and we've been looking at practices both within this country and abroad. And Julie was a very key part of that in its early stages. And we've also surveyed people within NIHR to see what's going on, because actually there is an awful lot of activity happening already, as it will be apparent to you from Julie's presentation. And this slide is aiming to get across that for impact, and I think it has come across from what we've heard already, is that you support it and enable it right from the very moment that you're framing the original research question, and as a funder through the whole research cycle. So the infrastructure we have in place, the way in which funding decisions are made, and Julie was talking about the guide that we've now got for panels to help them make those decisions, having a look at the quality of impact plans. Then at the other end, how you support the findings from that research and learn from the whole piece. What is it? What makes for highly impactful research? Going back and doing that, and there's definitely an issue about really sort of understanding about works in this space, but you'll see very deliberately at the centre of that slide is researcher skills and capabilities is absolutely core to this, which is sort of the point I was making earlier. The two things are really highly interdependent. So with that, I will hand over to Claire.
Thank you, Candace. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I thought it'd be useful just to, Candace mentioned our vision for impact, and we thought it'd be just useful just to talk to you a little bit more about that, just to, it'd be a helpful background and give you a flavour of some of the work that's currently underway to achieve this vision. And we have, this vision was agreed really it's a 5-year vision, and it was agreed in 2018, and we're 4 years into that vision, and it's overseen by, there's a cross NIHR impact working group that oversee it, and we have an impact plan as well that we review and update annually to help deliver on the vision. And it has 5, you'll see it has these 5 broad but interconnected areas. If you could just click, Candace, please. Yeah, and the first is kind of around maximising funding processes for impact. And that's examples of some of the work we do around that is research and research studies on narrative CVs, developing the practice guides that we, Julie and Candace just mentioned, for applicants and committees. We're also developing evaluative approaches into our practice. So if you could just click again, Candace, please. So we're developing logic models and theories of change and implementing monitoring and evaluation learning frameworks for strategic areas of work. And we're also, capacity building and developing capacity is at the heart of what we do as well. And we both provide training and support for both our staff, but also for the NIHR workforce that we engage with, whether that's researchers, applicants, potential applicants, and panel members as well, and provide a range of resources. And we're also committed to learning from others and learning from other organizations. So we play an active role in collaborations and networks such as Ensuring Value in Research Network. There's the Transforming Evidence Funders Network. And then in the UK, there's the Association of Medical Research Charities and NIHR Impact Coffee Club, which is a community of practice for just sharing learning with the evaluation, research and funders community. And then periodically we surface evidence of how we are progressing, because we have a responsibility to do that as a funder. And we have, I suppose, an array of mechanisms for evidence capture and at different levels. So we, for example, we have project monitoring and evaluation, we have program level monitoring and evaluation, and then we have cross NIHR system level monitoring and evaluation. And we've developed an outcomes framework, which is a communication and learning tool. And essentially it sets out the medium to long-term changes that we as an organization want to achieve from our collective activities. And they are articulated through shared outcome statements, which are underpinned by a raft of indicators, which are currently being developed and tested, and evidence is being gathered against them. So we will be then able to show evidence of how we're progressing against our aims and objectives. And we really are, we're, as an organisation, we're committed to developing NIHR as a learning organisation and becoming a healthy, as Julie said, like building, becoming a healthy learning and or embedding a healthy and learning and evaluation culture within the organisation. And really the direction of travel is we're moving towards kind of more inclusive monitoring and evaluation learning approaches as well. Next slide, please, Candace. So just to give you a flavour of some of the RDS relevant activities that are nested within our impact programme, and it's the impact practice guide that Julie was talking about earlier, and the 6 areas and guiding questions that are within that. And that's a practice guide prototype which is adaptable to different stakeholders, and as Rebecca mentioned earlier, they have incorporated those 6 areas into the impact practice guide in West Midlands. And also in NIHR we run impact strengthening workshops for applicants during live competitions, and we've incorporated those key areas into materials that we use for those workshops. And those impact strengthening workshops are ways to, it's really about helping applicants to apply impact principles into their research plans in advance of submitting their stage 2 application. And then the impact review practice guide itself was, as we were talking about previously, was developed for peer reviewers and funding committees to help them to support them when they're reviewing their impact plans. Next slide, please, Candace. And so other tools and resources that we have available, we have the impact toolkits, which is available on NIHR Open Learn, which Julie was also talking about, and we had provided training. So we provided formal impact training to both our staff and the RDS champions. And this is the training that Rebecca was talking about earlier. And we also have a standalone self-paced e-learning course on impact called Introduction to Impact Through the Lens of NIHR, and it's freely available and open access, and that's available on NIHR Open Learn to everyone. You just have to register it, and it's self-paced, so you can complete it in your own time. And we also have a series of animations for potential applicants and award holders and anyone involved in research coming soon, and they'll be shared through the normal kind of NIHR channels and NIHR TV, and likely to via NIHR Open Learn as well. So next slide. I think that's over to you, Candace. Yeah.
Pick up here. So hearing that, you think it's all great. We've got it all sorted, but our work has revealed issues that may well be sort of familiar to you. So despite this huge quantity of effort across NIHR, there are still issues within NIHR itself. There are some areas where I think there's a feeling that we can focus a lot on throughput and getting calls sort of delivered, rather than necessarily putting a lot of energy into the outputs. And so there's a feeling that the culture could shift further in that direction. The practice across NIHR is quite variable. Some programs really have this at their core and others less so. Some really work hard to, for example, get policymakers or end users as part of their priority setting and decision-making process, others less so. The evidence base for impact, as I was signaling earlier, is variable, and I think Julie would probably agree there's still more to go on that one. And as was being identified earlier, you can produce this great piece of research, but getting the pathway to impact, really getting dissemination and knowledge mobilization of that research, can feel like it's something that requires resources that aren't currently available at the minute. when you're trying to align your research to end users, particularly if they're policymakers, then the research timelines can really get in the way. And so through our engagement, people have talked about, does it suggest perhaps prioritising different sorts of research like evidence synthesis more to help policymakers who want quick answers in particular areas? I think, again, as was being alluded to earlier, the environments in which people work aren't always conducive to supporting impact, and certainly historically there's sort of focus on high impact papers as opposed to high impact change has been an issue, though clearly, as we were hearing, we've heard that is changing over time. Those research outputs being visible and crucially accessible is a big issue. That is one of the things that we work on very hard in my centre, is taking complex findings and trying to make them easily readable and understandable by people. And that's something that matters if you're going to get to your audiences. And then last but not least is the culture into which this research is going. It isn't always embracing or prioritising research. One of the quotes from our first round of research was that research in a trust can be a show dog, not a work dog. And certainly as somebody who's worked in trusts, I've seen research sort of demarcated. It's been separated from improvement activities. It's been separated from workforce development, say, actually, to pick up Mark's area of work, when actually they could be integral wholes. But we're not alone in struggling with these agendas. Certainly the work we've done shows that this is actually challenging for everyone dealing with all these issues. So these are just some headlines of the areas in which we think we can make sort of further improvement, but to emphasize, as I was saying before, building on a lot that has gone before. So there's something about the overall sort of strategic coherence and oversight of the agenda within NIHR, developing that culture across the organisation. And something that came up a lot in our engagement was sort of the parallels to patient and public involvement. It was interesting how Mark pulled that out as a really key thing, but actually if we saw a knowledge mobilisation, say, in the same way as we see PPI, and expected it, just like PPI, to be the letters through the stick of rock, then that could be really helpful. Strengthening our research and research activities so that we do know better what works, how we can do this better. Making our expectations more explicit, but crucially supporting those with good examples and training, as we're trying to do. On the publishing side, we think there's further to go in terms of coherence across the piece. At the moment, different elements of NIHR support that in different ways. And one thing that sort of is really dear to my heart is this links between researchers and end users. We've developed this huge infrastructure in NIHR which facilitates that, but at the moment it's quite separate. Each element of that infrastructure is quite separate from other elements of the infrastructure, and indeed from our core funding programs. Could we get the whole to be greater than the sum of the parts more than it currently is? Back to Claire.
Okay. Oh, I'm on. Thank you, Candace. Yeah, so, and well, I just wanted to touch on the future research assessment programme consultation on the design of the future UK research assessment exercise. And Julie talked about the REF as a driver as well, and just that we welcomed, as NIHR, we welcomed the opportunity to respond to the recent consultation, because even though REF is only one part of our impact story, we're very mindful that of the burden it places on the people we fund and support. So we really welcomed the opportunity to have a say in response to the consultation, which we just submitted over a week and a half ago. And the opportunities that Candace just mentioned, chime with some of the common themes identified throughout our response. And our response was informed by our role as a funder in the health and care ecosystem, our NIHR's policies, and it built on feedback that we collated from a sample of stakeholders from across the NIHR community. And in the consultation for us surfaced aspects very relevant to the impact agenda and important to NIHR, which are already evidenced through our existing policies and supportive initiatives that we have in place, for example, around responsible use of metrics and open access. But the common themes identified really kind of captured current NIHR thinking in the context of a future research exercise. For example, around reinforcing public engagement and involvement, particularly with non-academic end users of research and engaging with them throughout the research process, and bolstering research that meets the needs of research users and communities. And also things like collaboration and maximising impact, like, for example, placing more emphasis on the environment elements and increasing recognition of the effective research processes that ultimately pave the way for impact to be realized, and also supporting, responsible evaluation and a learning culture, and incorporating opportunities for feedback and learning, and supporting responsible monitoring and evaluation learning practices as well. Next slide, please. So this slide really, this picture, it was really just simply to, I suppose, make the point of what we're trying to do as research funder, and that really is to optimize the chances of impact being realized downstream through our funding processes, practices, and supportive activities, as opposed to delivering the impact ourselves, as we recognize we're a few steps removed from that as a funder, and that impact realization is primarily outside of our direct control. And although we're thinking about the whole life cycle and what we can do, we're thinking about what we can do as a funder that's within our control. And we, so optimizing how we fund our practices, providing incentives and initiatives can help to provide the momentum needed to increase the likelihood of research achieving impact realization beyond, I suppose, and eventually benefits to society. But if we don't provide, I suppose, appropriate and timely impact enablers in place throughout the research funding life cycle, then there's a risk that there won't be enough momentum or capacity to reach impact realization, and there is a risk that the research might just end without having opportunities for evidence uptake or use, or to diffuse the research findings across the health and care system. So the focus of this work is really on kind of, I suppose, impact enablers and how we can do things more consistently and comprehensively and learn and improve how we do that. And yeah, and so I hope you found that helpful and it gave you some food for thought. And we just had a couple of questions that we wanted to use this opportunity to ask you. And the first is really, do these findings or what you heard resonate with your experience? And the second is, what more could we do as a funder to support you in your role, whether it's in your role as an RDS advisor, your role as a researcher, or as in your role as a stakeholder working with the RDS?
Thank you very much to Claire and Candace. Well, any comments or responses to the two questions? I don't know whether you want to put these questions up again, just, or whether we want to put them in the chat.
Yeah, I can paste them in the chat there now.
Oh, there are questions, comments. Maybe I start with Rebecca.
Hi, hello, and thank you for that. Like all the other presentations, really great today. I had a couple of questions, so apologies. Really some practical issues, I guess, that occurred to me while you were talking. The first one is around resources, which is a common problem, especially if we're advising researchers. So like PPI and to some extent EDI, this needs to be properly resourced, and that culture change has happened, certainly within PPI. And I wondered how the specific funding of impact activities is shifting within the NIHR, and if you could say a bit more about that. And also, perhaps slightly more personally, I was thinking more about the kind of capacity building and how you support researchers. And so how an impact agenda might affect how, say, an early career researcher PI might be viewed within different programs.
That's both very pertinent questions, Rebecca, and I think the resources one is an important one, and it's certainly on our agenda to potentially include as part of our recommendations from the review, and it would be really helpful to have a sense from you all about where those resources would be best. We have, as some of you will know, there are dedicated resources, for example, for the enhanced dissemination work that runs in a number of the programs. But some people, for example, have talked about the value potentially of dedicated knowledge mobilization teams to work with research teams to support them. Yes, indeed, there are then questions of, or do you have somebody who is a knowledge mobilization expert who's part of the research team and you expect to resource that as part of the bid? Those are all sort of open questions, but I think it's a really pertinent and good one. Thank you. In terms of capacity building and early career researchers, obviously the messages we've given there are that we would hope that early career researchers would see this as an important agenda. Certainly for some of the fellowships, you've got dedicated support for knowledge mobilization. I don't know whether Claire, you've got any reflections on that one.
I mean, I think there's an opportunity as well, thinking about, as developing resources, that there's an opportunity, there's still prototypes, so there's an opportunity, to test, if you're thinking specifically about resources such as some of the toolkits or that, or the impact practice guide, there will be opportunities, to get, to test or utilize those with potentially early career researchers as well, and work with us to do that and share ideas as well and see how they land as well. So we'll be very much open to that as well, because they're still in, I suppose, prototype stages, and that can be adapted and tested and utilized as well.
Go on, Claire, sorry.
I was just going to, to the prior question around kind of the funding of impact activities as well. I think just to add to that is, yeah, there's like some schemes, like our health protection research units obviously have knowledge mobilization fellows now as well, but the actual funding of activities, I think some programs, I think it varies as well across programs, but generally if it's thought, if you can make a case and build it into the application and plan from it from the outset, which at the same time is not always feasible either, but then the program will, if you can make a rationale for that, then they will then they will allocate resource for that and accommodate that. But I know that's, at the same time, I know that's not always feasible from the outset as well.
Julia, I didn't know whether you had any comments you wanted to make on that from your perspective, because you may have a useful perspective on that.
Just trying to unmute there. It's difficult, isn't it, from the vantage, there's so many different vantage points here that, the point you're making about the, what NIHR can do, facilitate and so forth. I think the only point I want to add into what you're saying is that everything is very varied across all of these things, all the programs, the schemes, the institutions and so forth. And the thing that all of us probably need to do is work out what the next step in the journey is for where we are. And I know that's more of a generic comment to what you said, but I think anything that is suggestive that we're at this point in the journey on anything is going to be misleading. Anything that suggests we're absent of something is misleading. So one of the things I've been really privileged with you guys to see is how much energy is put into getting this right, healthy, meaningful, etc. So yeah, more of a roundup comment to that, to just say we all have, you know, a point in the journey we're at, and if we can start there, we're in a better place.
Thanks. I think I want to just give Jayanti and then also Sabina an opportunity to raise their questions or comments. Jayanti?
Thank you. I don't have any question. I have some comments, and this is very much my personal clinical experience. I have been in Kent for a long time, and I have worked about 10 years in different NHS organizations in Kent, at least 3. I have worked very closely with the clinical departments as well as research and development departments. And what I find is that these departments sometimes, or majority of the time, work in isolation and make the strategy and decision in isolation. So I think probably this is one of the reasons why things don't move forward, because they don't have a shared vision and shared strategic aims. Second thing is that whenever there is someone within the organization with the NIHR training, whether it is an MD, PhD, in a clinical academic role, those organizations have a better clinical research leadership, career development pathway, and better funding and strategies. Where you don't have these things, no matter how good the clinical departments or how good their R&D is, things don't move forward with regards to research and clinical research. So my suggestion, based on my personal experience, would be that if you could plant somebody who is NIHR trained, clinical academic within the R&D or within the organization, that might help to move the things faster.
Thanks. Sabina?
My question is about, you know, the it depends factor, right? So when we have a research result, or when we get asked, you know, as researchers, you know, so what are your conclusions? You know, a lot of the times, you know, we end up saying, well, it depends. So research is complex and the results of research are complex. I think that's a barrier to impact, because, you know, the public and implementation and change wants clear result and clear guidance of, you know, how to do things. So the two questions are, is the it depends factor a sign of poor research? I don't necessarily think so, but what are the opinions? Should good research always actually be able to, you know, sort of get those clear messages out? And if we can't because of the complexity, what that says about the research? And how do we solve that problem? Because sometimes, you know, exactly, research results and findings and things are complex.
Thanks. Can I just check,